Happy New Year, and welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Emily MacArthur. This broadcast is a tool to build movements, to provide a working class analysis of events, and put forward a clear strategy in the fight against the billionaire class and their political servants. Last year, we brought you live coverage of the elections. We reported from the ground and held rallies in Dearborn, Michigan, where we organized alongside Jill Stein, Abandon Harris, and working class activists for the strongest independent anti-war vote against both Harris and Trump for their support for the genocide in Gaza and anti-worker agenda. We reported live from the Boeing machinist picket line and discussed with rank-and-file workers how to escalate the struggle to win real raises and restore defined benefit pensions. We reported from on the ground at protests outside of the DNC and from the anti-war encampment protests at universities across the country. We fought the Seattle Democrats' shameful attempt to undermine our historic $15 an hour minimum wage victory won over a decade ago by Working People, Socialists, and Chamoisawant's Socialist City Council office. In this, our movement won a major victory, and the Democrats and big business were forced to back down. As of January 1st, all workers in Seattle now make a minimum of $20.76 an hour, the highest minimum wage in any major city in the country. We also brought you interviews with Chris Hedges, Jill Stein, Revolutionary Blackout Network, and more. We covered Amazon workers fighting to unionize and UAW auto workers, writers, nurses, and other workers on strike. We spoke with teachers, tech workers, and others fighting in their unions for resolutions calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, and to rescind their leadership's undemocratic endorsements of Biden, the strikebreaker-in-chief, and his equally anti-worker, pro-war successor, Kamala Harris. All of this was made possible through the efforts of members of Workers Strike Back, the organization we launched nearly 2 years ago to carry forward the fighting record and approach of Chamoisawant's Socialist Council office on a national scale. Workers Strike Back is fighting for an end to the Israeli state's genocidal war and occupation on Gaza, a $25 an hour minimum wage, good union jobs for all workers, affordable housing, and Medicare for all, and an end to racism, sexism, and all oppression. We believe the only way that we can begin to win any of this is by breaking with both the Democrats and the Republicans and building a new party of, by, and for working people. Over 750,000 people rejected the logic of lesser evilism last year to cast a vote for Jill Stein, the strongest independent anti-war candidate against the warmongering anti-worker agendas of both Harris and Trump. We urgently need to carry this momentum forward this year to build a truly independent anti-war working class movement. The last 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration have clearly shown that the Democratic Party is a dead end for working people both in the U.S. and around the world, and for the planet itself. But Trump is no alternative, and his Frankenstein cabinet of billionaires and attack dogs for the ruling class is gearing up for a slew of attacks on working people and the oppressed. His vicious onslaught on immigrants, promising the biggest deportation operation this country has ever seen, will not improve the wages or working conditions of native-born workers, but instead help to drive them down for all workers through ruthless divide and conquer and deepening exploitation. And it is not a pro-worker move at all that Sean O'Brien from the Teamsters and Bernie Sanders have both backed up Trump's anti-immigrant positions by speaking out against HB1 visas. Workers Strike Back is urgently building for a national organizing conference on February 22nd in Seattle to discuss immediate next steps for the movement to fight the rich and their two parties. The event will be live streamed on this channel, but it's vital that as many people as possible from around the country join us in person to carry forward our movement's momentum from the elections and prepare our next steps. If you think you can make it, please register at workersstrikeback.org now and make your travel arrangements. The following day in Seattle, February 23rd, we'll be holding our first in-person national convention of Workers Strike Back, where we will democratically decide on our priorities for the upcoming year and elect a new steering committee. All members of Workers Strike Back are welcome and encouraged to attend our Democratic convention. That's why, if you agree with our demands and are sick and tired of the endless sellouts from both corporate parties, especially so-called progressives like Bernie, AOC, and the Squad, we urge you to become a member of Workers Strike Back. If the shameless, unapologetic sellouts of all these so-called progressives show us anything, it's that we can't afford to wait for someone else to build an alternative for us. We, as working people, need to build it ourselves, and we need to start now. Workers Strike Back members are organizing chapters around the country, and you can join today to become an active participant in the fight not just against new attacks from Trump and both parties of the billionaires, but also to build the movement for real gains like Medicare for All. By becoming a member, you also help make this broadcast possible. We don't take a dime of corporate cash, and we rely on the support of working people like you. Go to workerstrikeback.org today to become a member, and we hope to see you in Seattle this February. Workers Strike Back is an active organization year-round, and we hold monthly meetings, both over Zoom and in person in areas where we have chapters to discuss lessons from history as well as strategy and tactics for the movement today. This week's episode is from one such meeting, our December meeting in Seattle, where members of Workers Strike Back met to learn the lessons from the 1934 general strike in Minneapolis, a strike led by socialists, which marked a turning point for the labor movement in the U.S. amidst the Great Depression. It was a shining example of the kind of militant approach needed to strike back against the bosses. If we want to rebuild a fighting workers' movement today, it's crucial that we learn from working class history. Tune in to our next episode to hear our analysis of ongoing labor struggles, including the recent walkouts at Amazon led by the Teamsters.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for showing up to the December meeting of Workers Strike Back here in Seattle. My name is Gwendolyn Hart, and I'm a member of Workers Strike Back and of Revolutionary Workers. We always kick these meetings off with a political discussion, and today we're going to talk about the 1934 Minneapolis general strike. As an organization dedicated to rebuilding a fighting labor movement, it's absolutely critical to take the time whenever we can to study the historical examples of past struggles and to derive the key lessons for our work today. And the 1934 Minneapolis strike is an extremely important example. In Workers Strike Back, we say that the single greatest obstacle to rebuilding a fighting labor movement today is the prevalence of business unionism. This is when a union leadership is taken over by rotten leaders who see themselves as having more in common with the bosses and our political institutions like the Democratic Party, instead of relying on the power of collective action and the picket line. Business unionists see the union as just another business, and they sell their own members again and again at the bargaining table and in backroom deals. The situation in 1934 was very similar, with labor dominated by a rotten leadership that in the midst of the ravages of the Great Depression led workers again and again into defeats and dead ends. The Minneapolis general strike is one of the watershed moments that broke this cycle. Here, they broke with their rotten union leadership and proved that a militant class struggle approach with serious democratically elected leadership and deep roots in the rank and file could take on an all-out war against the bosses and win. This victory showed working people across the country what was possible, and that echo led to the powerful labor movement that swept the entire country for the 1930s. That movement won big wage increases, job security, and huge victories like the New Deal and Social Security. The Teamsters Union of today still claims credit for this incredible strike, but the bureaucratic leadership does not teach the key lessons of the struggle. We recently saw this in how the Teamsters leadership under Sean O'Brien, the current president, conducted the struggle for a UPS contract. Instead of taking the 350,000 UPS workers out on strike, he took a last-minute settlement behind closed doors with historic concessions on pensions and permanent part-time positions in order to appease the bosses and avoid a strike. This is exactly the kind of sellout that the Minneapolis Teamsters in 1934 had to guard against in their struggle. Nowadays, O'Brien spends his time cozying up with Donald Trump as if there's any advantage for working people in canoodling with a billionaire. And Shawn Fain, the president of UAW, another prominent example in labor leadership today, spent the entirety of the last election carrying water for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. He called Biden the most pro-union president since FDR, even after Biden used the power of the federal government to break a railroad worker strike. The 1934 Minneapolis struggle shows that we can't put our faith in elected politicians, not even so-called progressive ones, which is also shown back then extremely glaringly when a supposedly progressive labor governor of the state tried to use the National Guard to break the Teamster strike. Today, every election cycle, business unionist leaders dump millions and millions of dollars of their members' dues into the campaigns of big business politicians who are hostile to working people and unions. This is an absolutely huge amount of wasted money that could have gone into organizing, recruiting, so making strike funds, and winning strong victories for working people. At the present moment today, we're seeing the second biggest increase in workers turning towards unions since the 1930s. That's why it's so important to have the discussions that we're having today to equip a militant rank-and-file labor movement with the lessons of past struggles to play an active role in the fight against the bosses today. And so, with that said, I'll hand it over to Justin.
So today we're talking about the Minneapolis General Strike of 1934, based on the book Teamster Rebellion by Farrell Dobbs. But I wanted to start by kind of laying out the situations before and after the strike to highlight its importance. So before the strike, the unionization rate in the U.S. in 1934 was less than 10%. The union leadership at that time had allowed membership to dwindle, and even when new members joined, there's basically no organizing to fight the boss for better wages or working conditions. This was in the depths of the Great Depression with high unemployment of 25%. And for those lucky enough to still have jobs, working conditions were terrible with average wage cuts of greater than 40% since the economic crash. Minneapolis was notorious for staunchly anti-union bosses organized into the Citizens Alliance. They've been able to keep Minneapolis mostly open shop, which meant that even in unionized workplaces, many workers still did not have union protections and rights. And that severely limited the power of those unions and allowed the bosses to hire many non-union workers. Today, we face a similarly low unionization rate as well as wages that have generally stagnated for decades. And this is while the cost of living has skyrocketed. And we see employers like Amazon that have endlessly broken the law and stopped at nothing to undermine unionization campaigns. And most union leaderships have been afraid to go up against this and have declined to try and unionize new workplaces. Compare this to the situation after the Minneapolis strike and two other big strikes in Toledo, Ohio and San Francisco, all in 1934. The situation afterwards was quite different. These events laid the basis for a mass unionization wave by providing an inspiring example of how to fight and win, invigorating a resurgence of a fighting labor movement. From 1934 until 1945, the unionization rate in the US increased from just under 10% up to 33% at its height. This was spurred on by further strikes that used militant picket tactics designed to fully shut down production, blocking road transportation or occupying the factories so that they were completely stopped until the bosses gave up. These strikes also spawned the movement that provided the pressure needed to win the New Deal, including the Social Security, Retirement, and Disability Benefit System in 1935, as well as other big working class gains. And it's important to understand on that these were not gifts from President FDR to workers. FDR took office, running on a fiscally conservative platform. These were concessions that FDR made to the working class out of fear of revolution if he refused to do so. Today, we see, a similar willingness to fight on the part of workers, as evidenced by the Boeing, auto workers, and screenwriters and actors strikes. We need to harness that energy to make similar breakthroughs like in the 1930s. So we should learn the lessons of how events like the 1934 Minneapolis strike changed the game for workers at the time. So I want to give a brief overview of the events in the Minneapolis strike and then talk about some of the key differences that put this strike on a much higher level than most of the other unions and strikes at the time. So this started with socialists working in the coal yards in Minneapolis. And so people probably know Minneapolis is, of course, very cold in winter. And at the time, everyone relied completely on coal for heat. These socialists organized among the coal truck drivers for several years leading up to 1934 and seized a strategically cold period during that year to go on strike. They caught the bosses off guard completely during the cold season by successfully shutting down virtually all the coal yards. This was a short, powerful strike of only a few days that forced concessions on key issues like wage increases, but most importantly, in terms of strategy, on union recognition of the workers as part of Teamsters Local 574. Coming out of this, there was still a big danger of the bosses effectively killing the coal drivers union during the summer months, when coal use was much lower. They were planning to do this by laying off pro-union workers and blacklisting them for rehire in the fall. From the beginning, the socialists had a goal of fighting for what is called industrial unionism, organizing all workers in the same industry into one union, because that's a far more powerful way of organizing workers compared to organizing them according to a narrow craft or organizing workers just at one workplace. The vulnerability of the coal union in summer actually made it a strategic necessity to take the industrial union approach. The The union had to be expanded if the foothold in the coal yards was going to survive. And victory of the coal drivers, along with other developments in the labor movement, inspired workers all over Minneapolis to want to unionize. So the socialist leadership set about broadening the membership of Teamsters Local 574 to include any worker connected to the trucking industry in all of Minneapolis. They kicked this off with a mass rally to celebrate the victory in coal and chart the next steps forward on the course of industrial unionism. By the end of that rally, the union's membership was 3,000 compared to 75 1 year earlier, which is pretty incredible. On that basis, and expanding the campaign to involve workers' wives, unemployed workers, farmers, and more, they led a strike that was able to shut down virtually all trucking traffic in Minneapolis for 10 days. Based on the strength of this action, they eventually forced the bosses to concede to recognition of the union, including most workers tied to the trucking industry beyond just drivers, such as helpers and platform workers. After this victory, even more workers signed up for membership in the union. As Farrell Dobbs, the author, notes, workers wanted higher wages and union protections, but they wanted to see that the union was willing to fight before they would throw their limited time and energy behind the effort. However, any agreement like this is only a temporary pause in the conflict between workers and bosses. In this case, it was a very short pause, as the bosses almost immediately started challenging significant aspects of the agreement that was won, including by lowering wages, firing some workers, and not recognizing certain types of workers as being included in the agreement. Rather than take this attack lying down, which would have been deeply demoralizing, the union opted to go back out on strike. And this time ended up being a much more brutal battle, though. Because of the demonstrated strength of the workers' strike, the repressive role of the police and army was forced much more out into the open. The bosses were desperately trying to move trucks using the police, but the striking workers were overall very successful at stopping them. So at one point, the police end up escorting a truck with dozens of officers armed with shotguns, and they opened fire indiscriminately on the striking workers, injuring over 60 people, including a dozen bystanders, many with shots to the back as they were running away. 2 of the workers died, murdered in cold blood. After this shocking violence, Minneapolis workers were furious, with 40,000 turning out in solidarity and mourning for the deceased workers' funeral procession, and 140,000 signed petitions to sack the mayor and police chief. This significantly escalated the stakes, and the governor sent in thousands of National Guard soldiers to put Minneapolis under martial law and break the strike. But despite this fierce state repression and police brutality, the month-long strike continued and ultimately prevailed, winning unionization for the majority of workers tied to the trucking industry in Minneapolis. The workers outmaneuvered and defeated the entrenched Citizens Alliance, which required the entire union to be involved and discuss how to strategically stay ahead of the bosses and the political establishment at every stage. The union went on to win significant wage increases shortly afterwards. For example, one worker noted that their wages almost doubled from $18 per week to $33 per week. Next, I want to try to answer the question, what was the difference with this Minneapolis strike that made it such a landmark battle? And first of all, this strike was led by a leadership that understood clearly that workers' interests are entirely antagonistic and irreconcilable with the interests of the bosses. Any gains that workers wanted to make will necessarily be at the expense of the bosses and vice versa. Given the conditions at the time, workers needed big wage increases, among other things, but in Minneapolis, they recognized that this would necessitate nothing short of a massive battle. It was very important in each stage of the strikes that the workers tried to shut down the industry as completely as possible to maximize the pressure on the bosses.
The other piece of it that I feel like we see so much throughout the strikes of the Teamsters in that period are that they completely strangle the bosses, right? They completely shut down the city's ability to function. And that's something that we haven't seen in recent decades, right? And I think that's something that absolutely has to be a feature of effective strikes, is to shut down the profits for the bosses, which is what they care about. In addition to making these escalations clear to the community, clear to the unemployed who might get pulled in to be scabs, like cutting across the boss's ability to flip the tables on you as workers and find enemies among the community or among the unemployed to scab.
As a bit of an aside, this is one of the disagreements that we had with Sean Fain's approach to the UAW auto workers strike last year. The strike, in fact, never included all the workers in the union and never shut down all the production facilities, which meant that money was left on the table and more gains could have been won by the workers compared to what was agreed to at the end. This point was actually highlighted by the most militant rank and file workers in interviews after the strike was over, with many of them noting that far more could have been won if the whole union was out on strike.
Obviously, we know resources are limited in any organization, but we were never asked if we were willing to make more sacrifices, and we were never asked how far we wanted to take it in the terms of like, what do you think about this as you guys are rank and file? What do you think about not having strike pay, but staying out an extra 2 weeks to just rattle them a little bit more? And maybe we would have got something, right?
Like we talked about, again, going back to the UAW stand-up strike, where there was so much willingness among workers to shut down every plant, right? That was the expectation from workers. We're going to shut down all the car plants. And instead, the leadership said, we have this really creative strategy where we're going to confuse the bosses by just shutting down a few strategic points, but not let them know which one it is. And we kind of pushed back and said, how much more effective it would have been not one day longer and one day stronger to eke out and lose your strike fund and cause workers to suffer financially and their families to suffer financially. What would have been powerful is fucking shut down every single plant. Like, that would have flipped the boss's lids, and they would have been like, shit, what did you want? Ready to sign.
But there were many other important elements to the Minneapolis strike as well. One is that this strike was waged as a struggle of the entire working class, rather than just the workers who were members of Local 574. So the author Dobbs highlights the role of, for example, the Women's Auxiliary. So back then, of course, the gender division within the working class was much deeper. So the workers in the union were basically all men, often with wives who took care of the household. And the fact that this strike got the wives actively involved in the struggle was a major step forward. Today, the same lessons should be applied to get family and friends of workers on strike actively involved in any struggle that's happening. The strike also featured mass rallies, sometimes with over 40,000 attendees. Imagine today if in the recent Boeing strike, the union had called for all workers in Seattle to come out to mass rallies at the picket lines. How inspiring would that be, and how much more pressure would it have put on the bosses to see this much support for the Boeing workers? This could have significantly increased the potential of the strike and would have been one necessary step towards winning back the pensions. Instead, we often saw that picket lines at Boeing were less than 10 people, which was never going to be enough to force Boeing to reinstate, the big things like the pensions. The Minneapolis strike leadership also forged unity with unemployed workers. The issue was basically either the workers and unemployed could be at each other's throats in a race to the bottom for employment at poverty wages, or they could unite to raise the living standard of the entire working class through wage increases for workers and more substantial relief for the unemployed. The workers also forged an alliance with farmers who were facing the same descent into poverty, and there were sympathy strikes of other unions, as well as solidarity donations of thousands of dollars from some of them, which was a huge amount back then, considering that workers' wages, as I mentioned before, were around $18 per week. And I want to highlight that, this differs a lot from the sort of passive mutual aid strategy that I think is currently pretty popular. They were not attempting to address, the daily existing hardships faced by people or make up for the absence or deficiency of state and social programs by redistributing the meager wages of workers. This aid was connected to and in support of an active class struggle through which workers would extract massive material concessions from the ruling class to address, declining living standards far beyond what could be done by redistributing workers' wages. This was, you could say solidarity as opposed to charity.
And I would say that what's important too from this struggle, but just other lessons we can take from other strikes as well is, and maybe you had mentioned this too, but just to say not to just forge links on like a moral basis, not just like to say like we want to link up with the unemployed or we want to link up with other unions or anything like that just because like we should be helping each other, but like the fact that as working class people, when we link our struggles together, they are all more powerful. So it is a moral question. We want all workers to have better lives, but it's not really, the moral part isn't the important part. It's that it's tactically much more powerful for all workers, unionized or ununionized, people who are working, people who aren't working, to be banding together and fighting for concessions against these bosses and for further organization of the working class.
The strike leadership also demonstrated how to overcome the sabotage of existing Teamsters union official leadership. So I want to give an example of how these union officials were oriented by going through the conditions that they had laid out for workers to go on strike. These conditions were, you must first negotiate with the employers. If you can reach no agreement with the employer, then you must go to arbitration with them. And one of the quotes is, if the employers refuse to arbitrate and there is no other alternative, you may proceed to consider the question of a strike. Note that according to this union official, if the employer accepts arbitration and the resulting contract is bad, that's it. They offer nothing on that situation. If arbitration is refused, next, in order to get the support from the international union, you must report the lack of progress in negotiations to the membership and hold a strike vote. Quote, the vote should be taken without any intimidation on the part of the members. Very revealing that they highlight possible intimidation by rank and file members rather than what actually would happen, which was intimidation by the union officials themselves to pressure the workers to not go on strike. 2/3 of members must vote yes. Then you must get approval from your joint council for the strike. Then you must ask the international union for its approval for the strike. Then you must wait until the international executive board has voted before taking any action. And the final quote is, if you go on strike before you receive the sanction of the international executive board, you will not receive any benefits whatsoever from the international union. So, I mean, this is a pretty embarrassing statement to have within the labor movement in the US, and needless to say, the leaders of this strike did not follow this procedure at all because they knew that what the workers needed could only be won through a fight that had to be approached strategically and with the right timing at every stage. This was not a battle that could be won within such a rigid and demoralizing step-by-step scheme. But on the other hand, the strike leaders also knew that going too hard against the existing union officials would have alienated sections of the rank and file workers and split the union. So they took the approach of organizing the workers and broader movement around what was necessary to win against the bosses, which created mass pressure so that the anti-strike union officials would not be able to decisively undermine the strike.
When you're talking about being part of a large organization, especially being part of an organization that has a bureaucratic leadership, that has a leadership that isn't taking, a class struggle approach, and UFCW is definitely one of those organizations. So many union leaders. The UFCW is particularly notorious for it. That the president of UFCW in New Jersey makes over $700,000 a year, while grocery workers don't have enough to actually buy groceries. Right? They're making $12 an hour, $15 an hour, whatever it is. What we should be doing is organizing national grocery worker strikes to really change the situation. So whether it's UFCW or any of these larger existing unions, the Teamsters, if we're putting forward class struggle ideas, if we're putting forward a fighting approach, we are going to come into conflict with the union leadership. We're going to come into conflict with those bureaucratic structures, and even organizing independently, you're going to come into that kind of conflict, right? And so I think this question then of how do we organize alliances with other working people, with other working class organizations, other unions? How do we build? This is what we've done over and over and over with our fights in Seattle, winning the $15 minimum wage, winning the Amazon tax. Every time it required getting thousands of people involved in a fighting movement that came up against that leadership of the existing organizations, came up against the political leadership of the Democratic Party, and was able to overcome that. But it was only because of that pressure of the movement from below.
The workers also successfully took on the government, police, and National Guard. And most importantly, the strike leaders had no illusions in Governor Olson, governor of Minneapolis at that time. And that's even though he was part of the Farmer Labor Party, which at that time was an independent party, independent of the Democrats and Republicans. And, even with that, Governor Olson was not a working class fighter and ultimately collaborated with the bosses at many points to try and get the strike to end, most notably with his carrying out martial law in the city. The leadership of the strike clearly understood that while Olson could be pressured into siding with the workers sometimes, he would never be a reliable ally and would become an outright enemy of the strike as the workers took on more and more militant tactics that would be necessary to win. They also had a clear understanding of the role of the police and the National Guard as tools of last resort for the bosses to defend their interests with violence when everything else that keeps workers down fails. But again, the question of how to deal with this was also always considered strategically. In the context of the beginning of the strike, arming the workers would have actually alienated the rest of the working class from the struggle. But once the police had showed their true colors and their willingness to commit murder to undermine the strike, the broader working class understood the need for the workers to defend themselves, and the union was able to send picketing workers out with defensive weapons to fight back. The strike also demonstrated how to effectively counter the corporate media. The local corporate newspaper in Minneapolis reliably put out the boss's messaging against the strike every single day. A lot of the messaging was red baiting, basically saying that the socialist leaders of the strike were secretly leading workers into violent insurrection against the workers' will. So the strike leaders developed a daily newspaper called The Organizer. It got the workers' message out that this was a strike for the basic decency of living wages, reasonable working hours, and recognition of the workers' right to unionize. And that in reality, the violence was coming from the bosses and their police and their National Guard. This was the first daily strike publication in the history of the American labor movement with a staggering circulation of 10,000 copies daily. By asking for a solidarity donation for each copy, the Organizer ended up being self-financing as well. Democracy and discipline within the union were important aspects of how the strike was carried out. Every significant decision about the strike was brought to the strike committee, and the biggest decisions, like whether or not to accept any particular deal to end the strike, were always brought to the full membership. Dobbs mentions an example of breaking of picket discipline by two of the strike leaders, Bill Brown and Grant Dunn, who tried to stop a scab truck in a reckless way, which ended up getting two workers shot unnecessarily. They took accountability for this mistake, and overall such mistakes were extremely rare in this strike. Members understood the importance of following democratically decided approaches to striking, which is crucial to avoid strategic mistakes that could endanger the workers' potential to win. And so ultimately, this strike was a resounding victory in which set the stage for an explosion of working class organization and power that forced massive concessions from the bosses, including wage increases, and ultimately the social security system we still benefit from today. But this was an uphill battle, and the details of the outcome of the final union election after the strike shows how much this was the case. Despite doing almost everything exactly right, there were still workers who voted against the union. For example, at 15 of the trucking companies, there were tie votes where 50% of the workers voted against the union, which, when I was reading it, it reminded me of the campaign in 2021 to defend Shama Sawant's seat on the city council against the right-wing campaign to recall her from office. In the end, we only won this campaign by 310 votes in an election where 40,000 people voted. That was also a massive victory, but these kinds of close margins should remind us of the importance of something I mentioned early on. We need to develop real fighters within the working class who understand that workers' interests are entirely antagonistic and irreconcilable with the interests of the bosses, because the bosses will take advantage of any opening, any mistake that we make to undermine our struggles. And I think, that's why we need to build Workers Strike Back, right? Workers Strike Back is trying to develop working class fighters who understand the need to break with the Democrats and Republicans, and who understand what it means to have a fighting labor movement. We're developing people who have the potential to lead outstanding victories against the bosses, just like what was done in Minneapolis in 1934.
If you're interested in participating in discussions like this and taking those lessons forward to fight for concrete victories, you should become a member of Workers Strike Back today and look for events in your local area. Go to workerstrikeback.org to get involved and help support our work. And don't forget to register for our organizing conference on February 22nd, 10 a.m. in Seattle. It's crucial that as many people attend in person as possible to chart a course forward to end the genocidal war in Gaza and rebuild a fighting workers' movement, like the kind that socialists and Minneapolis Teamsters fought for and helped build nearly a century ago. Shama Sawant, Jill Stein, Chris Hedges, Revolutionary Blackout Network, Abandon Harris, and more will be joining us. Please register now if you can make it at workerstrikeback.org and make your travel arrangements.
If you're in the Chicago area, Workers Strike Back will be joining the Chicago People's March for Justice on January 20th to protest the inauguration of Donald Trump and his administration's planned attacks on immigrants and working people. We'll be having our Chicago monthly meeting in person on Tuesday, January 14th to prepare for the protest. You can register to join us at workersstrikeback.org/events.
And finally, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. If you've been watching On Strike, you'll know that we bring coverage, analysis, and strategy for our movements that you simply won't find in mainstream media. We don't just comment on events, we're an active part of struggles on the ground around the country, and we bring you interviews with working people fighting at the forefront. If working people are going to win real victories, we need an honest, open discussion about the strategies that will be most effective in taking the movement forward. That's what On Strike brings you from a fighting working class perspective, and that's what we'll continue to do in the year to come. Solidarity.